The American Civil War is a cataclysmic event that has generated probably more bound volumes in the Library of Congress than anything else in our history. And we've been looking a little bit at how the Declaration of Independence, to talk about where we started back in early January, was at first the establishment of a creed that Americans fought a war of independence over, and what we've been asking ourselves and what Americans asked themselves at the time, up to and including the Civil War and well beyond, was, does the creed still speak to us? And did it speak to people who were engaged in that Civil War? And in the few pages that I wrote in your background, which is available online too with all of our agendas, my argument is, yes, it had a lot to do with, particularly from either persons who were proponents of the continued relevance of the Declaration, such as Lincoln, or people who were opposed to the whole concept behind that. It was very definitely at the root of what became known as our Civil War. So that Civil War lasted 5 military seasons, if you will, from the time that the roads were dry enough to move armies and march until the early winter time, when armies on north and south went into some type of a bivouac somewhere. The important two things I'm going to talk about tonight. One is that the title here was intended to be a little bit provocative. I call it the Second American Revolution. And by most objective terms, it was a revolution in the sense that a whole property system was abolished, at least from the standpoint of the Constitution. The country, which had been disparate states, some taking the North as their moniker and some the South, was united under a stronger federal government, and it was the beginning of what we saw in terms of the stronger federal government we have today. The country was united with a transcontinental railroad system that had its origins in legislation passed by the Congress in 1862, right after the first year of the Civil War. The Republic all of a sudden had one national currency. The federal courts had suzerainty over state courts in many important respects, particularly in defining civil liberties, at least in terms of the Constitution. Enabling laws had to be passed, and we can talk at another point about whether they were or were not sufficient. And obviously there were new meanings for what liberty was in constitutional enactments, beginning with the 13th Amendment, which was approved by Congress on January 31st, 1865. It was ratified by the end of the year in 65 after Lincoln's death. And the 14th and 15th Amendments, which by the late 1860s sort of created the constitutional corpus of what Americans had been contesting with arms back during the early part of the 60s. So that is one thing. So there was a transformation that was set in motion and was certainly complete by the end of the 19th century in terms of the rise of a new a nation that was fraught from a social standpoint with lots of divisions and strife. But in terms of foreign policy, all of a sudden we had surpassed the English as the country with the greatest military and also the most economic power. But the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is what we've been talking about for 4.5 months now, and that is we as human beings connect with people in the political realm or people we see on TV and today in social media who connect with our experience in some fashion. And the remarkable and transformational thing about the Civil War was that there were, by various estimates, some 10,000 cities and towns that gave up people in uniform to either the North or the South. And many did not come back. The blood toll of that conflagration between Americans was tremendous. So there were about 3 million who fought in the Civil War on both sides, about 600,000 soldiers, including 20,000 black soldiers died. And by way of reference, American battle deaths during the years 1861 through 1865 totaled about half of all of the American losses in all of the wars through Afghanistan. And so people had an intimate connection to the war, and it wasn't a theoretical dinner conversation. It was someone who had been lost, someone who had been maimed, someone who'd lost a limb, someone who had been liberated and was somewhere else trying to pull together their family. There was lots of stories, or at least as many stories as there are towns. But it's the absence of persons in chairs at tables that goes some way, not all the way certainly, in explaining why it took another 100 years after the Civil War and its constitutional amendments and so forth for the country to come together enough to create federal law that would enforce those constitutional enactments. And we'll talk a little bit about that next time, and how, if you want to look at how the circle sometimes comes around, there is some meaning to that. I pointed out in my background some things which, in looking at tonight, especially with the report of the fire department, how people go out and take chances all the time to save people's lives or to help people survive scares and actual life-threatening experiences. To spend the next couple minutes talking about the dead on various Civil War battlefields is not really in order. But I would point out that an historian who some of you have read, and it's not really important who he was, but was in recent years in conversation with someone who was had a doctorate in American history, and ran into this person at the Lincoln Memorial. And we were talking about the meaning of that memorial, and did it still speak to us, and so forth. And that particular historian reported that, well, what he feels when he comes up those steps, those long steps, most of all are the sacrifices that were made, and such as at Antietam. And this other person said, "What was that?" So Antietam was the worst single battlefield experience in American history. 15 hours of battle, almost 21,000 dead, severely wounded and missing. If you put this in perspective, up to that point, that one battle of 15 hours had a total of dead, wounded, and missing that was greater than the combined losses in the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War. And here's another grim perspective on that. It was nearly equivalent to 1/2 of the American military dead during the 10-year war in Vietnam. 15 hours, hand to hand. Because people, what were they fighting for? What was driving them? And I think we should ask ourselves that. For some, it was liberty. But it might not have been liberty for someone else. It might just have been what they thought was at risk, because at that point, the South was in the North. It was in at least a border state. It was in a state which was part of what was considered to be the North at the time. So there were people from the North who thought they were fighting for their homesteads, and there were people from the South who thought they were fighting for good old Maryland. Well, that is what I'm asking you to plumb a little bit, and we'll come back to that next week. So that was one. But in terms of how we get forward, this terrible cost was such that people were wondering, is this war just about restoring the status quo, or is it about something higher and something better? How do you begin to justify the toll? And people in the North and South were both debating that. In the North, of course, the leader was the president, and at least it was expected that he would be asking that. And at first, he was trying to keep the Union together. Antietam, in a battle before that known as Shiloh, convinced him and a number of his generals that it had to be a war fought not just to win some points on battlefields, but it had to be to defeat the other side, and if necessary, to take their property, which interestingly at the time meant the abolition of slavery, or at this point, it would have been the emancipation of slaves who were otherwise important to the war effort in the South. And that brings me to the point of why I'm standing here in front of you. In December of 1862, Lincoln gave his second, what we today call the State of the Union address. And at that time, it was just a message to Congress. And he spent, as presidents usually do, a good part of the time talking about the expansion of the country and da-da-da-da, but he couldn't obviously ignore the Civil War. And in the last couple of minutes of his speech, he said what was appropriate at the moment, because on January 1st, 1863, his Emancipation Proclamation, his permanent proclamation, was going to go into effect. And at that point, he said some things which are echoed later on in the Gettysburg Address, where he's trying to define a higher purpose for the war that would speak and connect to the Declaration and would point toward the future. And in that, he said he departed from the mundane, and he said, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history." And you can hear echoes today, interestingly. "We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." And what was that last best hope for? And that was the democratic experiment that it was launched in Philadelphia nearly 7 years beforehand. It wasn't until another full year of more catastrophe, more deadly battles, which included such names that most of you know: Chancellorsville, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, Chickamauga, 50,000 dead at Gettysburg. And at the end of '63, for the first time in 2.5 years, Lincoln was able to give words to the higher aspiration, not just of a military aim or a military necessity, but something that would raise hearts and minds. And that was when he spoke in Gettysburg. After those 50,000 dead were put in graves, even though they were shallow graves for the most part, not to mention 5,000 horses and mules and a lot of other deadly flesh. The governor of Pennsylvania thought it was time to bring order to the countryside. And after doing that with new burial techniques and caskets and more formal ceremonies, he knew that his next task was to, in effect, cleanse the scene with an official consecration of a new cemetery. And he asked around, came up with a great orator, and it was a man named Edward Everett. He had been a governor of Massachusetts. He was known as a great orator. He had spoken many times in the East and had even given dedications to cemeteries at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. So he seemed like the obvious thing. Lincoln was not directly invited, but thought it was a good idea to attend. And he just asked for a place to be on the dais, and he was given a chance to speak moments before the final hymn and benediction. And without any pride and with immense humility, he got up after Everett spoke for just 3 minutes under 2 hours. And he had 272 words, which took 3 minutes to deliver. In fact, in those days, photography isn't like it is today. You just take out your phone and you click it. You had to set up your tripod and you had to do all that. He was already sitting down before they flashed the photograph, and there was only one of him in Gettysburg, and it was that one. But it was there that he set out the ideological terms that would bring eventually the Republican Party in '64 to identify abolition of slavery as a war aim, but also as a strategic necessity for the United States after the war, and for the support that was necessary for the constitutional amendment in January '65. And the words are known to you. I'll just read the last few, and hopefully they do ring true to you. The world will little know, no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Next time we'll talk about why we celebrate the 4th.